All right, guys, good afternoon. Welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. And yeah, we got about 2 minutes, then we'll start class. For now, though, hope you're all doing great and had a good spring break. So, yeah, get comfortable. I'll be right with you guys just about 2 minutes. Hi, Remy. Good to see you. Just another minute or so. Welcome back, guys. Just a few moments here, a couple seconds, really. Okay, nice. Well, it's 2:20, so since that's our time, I'm going to get things started. Welcome back to class. Anybody that's arrived already, good to see you guys. And to all the rest, hopefully we'll all have full attendance in just a moment, but I know it takes a few minutes for the group to trickle in. If you're here and watching, just feel free at any point to leave behind some type of comment in the chat, just so I can keep a track record of the attendance that's been coming and going so far. And welcome back after spring break. I hope you all had a nice, relaxing time off. Me, it was pretty nice. I actually didn't get the full week off because you guys may know that I teach at a few different institutions. One of the places where I teach is Chapman University over in Orange, and they have a different spring break schedule that was the prior week. So actually, I had to go in for just a couple classes, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but it was a lighter schedule having that extra time off. I'm also fully vaccinated now. That's kind of nice. I got the second dose last Saturday, so no longer have to worry about the coronavirus, I guess, which is cool. I didn't suffer any side effects or anything really from either dose. Maybe just slight fatigue for like maybe 24 hours or so. But other than that, it's nice to be on the other side of the vaccination process. You know, after you survive a pandemic, like I guess all of us have, you kind of realize when you're out there vaccinated, man, like there's all kinds of little things that you're worried about over the past year, like getting too close to a person, worrying about putting your life at risk if you're breathing the same air with other people and stuff. But now with the vaccine, I have a lot more confidence just walking around in the world and looking forward to a return to more public activities as we go through the rest of the year and other people getting vaccinated. So nice to get that down. And good to see all you guys, Ryan, Philip, Corey, Anna, Elizabeth, Matt, Alex, and Remy. Lan, rather. I know that you have a different name that you use as a username. So good to see you guys. Let me ask a question. Did any of you guys notice my Canvas announcement from earlier today? I delivered that through Canvas just to notify you guys about the midterms that have been graded. Who can confirm that you've seen that one? Just let me know. Okay, perfect, good. So I just let you know in the message that I have graded the midterms now, and I will release the scores to any student that just emails me. So simply email me, please, to request your grade. And once you do that, I'll reply back to you within 2 days at most. I just ask that you give me a little window of time because I teach a lot of classes. I have 8 classes. I have a lot of emails that I'm receiving all the time. But once you do send me your request, you're in line, and for sure I will get back to you by my policy no later than 2 days after that. So to those that have sent me a grade request today, I've been teaching all day, so I haven't been able to get to it, but I'll reply back to you in short order, and you'll get your answer before Thursday. I'll send you detailed comments, and you'll know about your grade. I do prefer to release these scores individually per student request. That's just my policy. So no, I don't put them on Canvas. And yes, you should check for your grades. So please send me an email inquiry so that I can just simply notify you how you did on the midterm. Anyway, we now continue with the semester, and we have a new chapter that we're going to start talking about today. I also wanted to let you guys know that the second homework assignment, that is supposed to have been due on the next week Tuesday, a week from today. But I just decided I want to make a slight adjustment to that due date. So I'm going to modify it to Thursday the 15th. That'll just give us a little bit more time to work on the topics in Chapter 5, and it'll give you a little bit more of a buffer in time. So anyway, next Thursday, the second homework assignment will be due, and I'm going to send you guys the instructions about that after this Thursday's class, so you have a full week to work on it. Okay, so just kind of checking in on the scope and the pace of the calendar. We're pretty much just, at this point, working on Chapter 5, and your second homework, that's going to be due next Thursday. Those that are looking for their midterm scores or anything else, if you haven't checked on it, please do email me so I can get back in touch with you. I like to keep an individual contact with students. Also, when you keep scores up there on Canvas, there's been all kinds of things that have happened in the past. Sometimes the whole system gets wiped. Sometimes there are hacking, and sometimes there are, lost files. So it's more secure, I believe, for me to keep a secure physical and electronic record of my own that you can simply check in with me to learn about. Okay. So if there are no questions about that stuff, then I guess I can get started. Long story short, send me an email to request a grade on your midterm. I'll get back to you within 2 days, and I'll give you the next homework assignment on Thursday. But today we're going to get started on Chapter 5 of our book. So we've covered a lot of different things so far already in the semester. We started with just discussion of fundamental concepts of logic. What is an argument even? What is deduction? What is induction? What is validity, soundness, inductive strength, right? After that, we looked at Chapter 1, which was all about some of these famous social psychology experiments. What are the stages of the critical thinking process? What are qualities of the good critical thinker? What are some of the obstacles that get in the way of doing it well? And what are some of the benefits that come from being a good critical thinker? Then we looked at Chapter 3, which was all about language and communication. What is language? What are different types of meanings and definitions? All of that. What are different styles of communication, rhetorical devices. And then Chapter 4 was the most recent chapter that we did before the midterm and the spring break. And that was all about knowledge. What is human knowledge? What does it take to achieve it? What are the component parts of it? And we talked about perceptual errors. We talked about sources of evidence, how to judge the testimony of experts, and all of that. Well, we continue now with a new chapter of the book, and it's Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 is all about what are called fallacies. Fallacies. So what are fallacies? Well, fallacies are when there are problems with an argument. When the argument has logical flaws or errors, then we say the argument contains a fallacy, or sometimes we describe it as being fallacious. So not all arguments are equal. Some are good and some are not so good. And those that have a fallacy are bad arguments. They're misleading. Sometimes they're manipulative, or sometimes they try to trick you into agreeing to a conclusion which seems reasonable based on the presentation of the argument. But if you know that it is a fallacy, you would understand that it's actually an invalid and an erroneous argument. So for as long as logic has been studied, thousands and thousands of years, people have defined and discussed what fallacies are. And that means that we've been able to identify and name specific examples of fallacies. When you know what a fallacy is, then you're able to avoid committing them yourself, and you're also able to point out and call people out for committing them when they're making bad arguments to you. So when a person commits a fallacy, you're not just supposed to be like, wow, cool point. You're supposed to say, I'm sorry, but that is a fallacy. That's personal attack. That's red herring. That's a straw man. And if you know what a fallacy is, you won't be tricked or manipulated or poorly served by these sometimes deceptively good arguments that are actually fallacious. Okay, so we got to know what fallacies are so that we're not duped, tricked, exploited, manipulated by them, and also then we can do our best to avoid committing them on our own end. So fallacies, what's the definition of a fallacy? Fallacy is just when an argument contains a logical flaw or error, and that's the problem. So yeah. So these fallacies are erroneous arguments. They are filled with error, have their problems and defects. We need to know what those fallacies are. So at the beginning of chapter 5, there's a little discussion of like a real world anecdote that kind of brings the reader into greater understanding of the topic that we will discuss. And that's something that we've seen throughout the semester. So like on chapter 1, if you remember, they started off chapter 1 by talking about those famous social psychology experiments. That was supposed to give a sense of the importance of being a good critical thinker. In chapter 3, they opened up with the description of the Benghazi scandal and the fact that in that case, miscommunication might have led to a shortage of resources for evacuated casualties at the embassy that was attacked. In chapter 4, they talked about these famous cases of medical error that led to people having like the wrong leg amputated. And that was supposed to show that when we process information, even highly skilled professionals can make cognitive errors and mistakes. Well, in chapter 5, to get this topic, started, they also offer us a little example from real life to kind of sense the importance of knowing what fallacies are and not being tricked by them. So they start the chapter with reference to this real case of a woman named Shannon Townsend. Okay. Now, who's Shannon Townsend? Well, she was just a student, and she was a really good student academically in high school. So she was a star student. She got very good grades. And because of that, she was able to get into the University of Colorado for college. When she got there, she was doing very well in her first semester. She was getting good grades, making friends. She had like a 3.9 GPA. She was on the honors roll. But the thing is, at the end of her freshman year, something bad happened. She got mixed up with and involved in like a cult movement. And this cult is actually led by a man named Jim Roberts, and it's called the Brethren. And one of the doctrines of the Brethren cult is that once you join, you're supposed to cut off all contacts with family members, friends, and others who are not members of the cult. So you're supposed to kind of isolate from them and just fully invest in the cult and living this nomadic lifestyle with those people. And ever since she joined them at the end of her freshman year, she's never been seen again. Now, you might hear the story and think, well, that's kind of random. That doesn't happen very often. But in fact, even if it's not the most common thing, she's not the only case. Hundreds of young people, in many cases college-age students, do similar things every year, being recruited into dangerous cult-type movements that are organized around excessive devotion to a single person or a single set of ideas. Now, why is it that these cults are capable of recruiting impressionable young minds and young adults like some in your own age group? Well, it's because at the time of life where you are, when you're a young adult, if you are, I know we have a variety of ages in some cases within the community college and within college, but for the most part, I know I'm talking to a lot of younger people that are recently out of high school. And so at that time in your life, maybe you can relate to this. You kind of struggle a little bit with newfound independence. You've been living your whole life as a child under the authority and guidance of your parents, which is for the good for the most part. But now as an adult, you're struggling to assert yourself in this world where now you are a fully independent person. And people at that stage of life, they want to form an identity. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. But sometimes your lack of experience in the world, your desire to fit in with something, your dependence on others, and your intolerance for ambiguity can push you to find greater favor with these kind of cult recruiters. Now, what kind of person, though, do you think would be the hardest type of person for such a cult to recruit and to win over to their ranks? It would be a good critical thinker, a kind of person who doesn't just listen along and agree to everything they hear, but instead stops for a moment and says, how though, how, why do you think that's true? What's the evidence? Can you show me proof of this claim that you're making? I don't believe it unless I can see substantial, reasonable evidence to support it. So those kind of inquisitive, critical minds are the toughest ones for cults to win over. They are relying on people to just kind of smile and nod and be like, wow, okay, that sounds really true and interesting. And that's what is said here in the quote that's given in the book by clinical counselor and cult specialist Ron Burks. They asked him, what do you think is the antidote to being in a cult? And he says the best way to avoid being targeted by a cult is to be well-informed and unafraid to ask questions. The antidote is critical thinking. Cults don't like people that are constantly thinking and asking questions. So sometimes these cults are effective because they rely on deploying fallacious arguments to people. They make fallacious arguments which may at least initially appear persuasive. And because of that, people find favor with the cult's message and then just join into it and lose whatever social life and situation they had before that. So we need to know what fallacies are so we are not the easy prey of such people, and that we can, in just general cases within life, not just in context of avoiding cults, not be won over by bad arguments that we hear from other people, from the media, from politicians, from marketers and advertisers. Okay, so we will learn about fallacies now. Now in this class, in the chapter 5, there are 3 separate groups of fallacies that are discussed, and we have different meetings to cover each one. So today, the plan is to talk about the fallacies of ambiguity. And then on Thursday, the next batch will be called fallacies of relevance. And then next Tuesday, we have what are called the fallacies of unwarranted assumption. So there's those 3 categories: ambiguity, relevance, unwarranted assumption. Today's lesson is all about the first, the fallacies of ambiguity. So let me write down the definition of the general concept of a fallacy of ambiguity. But I want to make sure one thing is clear to you before I write it. This term, fallacy of ambiguity, is a category term. It is a category of fallacies, and there are 5 members that fall under it. Okay, so I don't want you to think that fallacy of ambiguity is itself the name of a particular fallacy. It's the name of a type of fallacy, and then there are 5 instances of that type. In a similar sense, the term mammal is a category name for different species of animals. Mammal, though, is not a species itself. It's a type of species, those that have warm blood and that give live birth. And so underneath the heading of mammal, we've got many different species, like lions, tigers, bears, cats, dogs, human beings. Okay. So in a similar sense, fallacy of ambiguity, the concept, is like the category term, and then the 5 different instances of it are like the species of it. Okay, so here we go, fallacies of ambiguity. So what is a fallacy of ambiguity? Here's what it is. It is when an argument contains sloppy grammar, ambiguous words, or a confusion between 2 similar concepts. So when an argument contains ambiguous words, sloppy grammar, or a confusion between 2 similar concepts. So that is the general definition of the category fallacy of ambiguity. Fallacies of ambiguity are defined in this way. They are arguments which contain ambiguous words, sloppy grammar, or confusion between 2 similar concepts, and that's the ambiguity in the nature of the words used, the confusing grammar, or a slipping and sliding between 2 different but related concepts. Now, underneath this heading, we have 5 individual members. And that's the real substance of the lesson going forward today. 5 fallacies of ambiguity, what are they? Okay, so let me list them. Can we all see this definition here? Have we written it down? Let me put it in the chat one time, just in case it's going to disappear too fast. So, Takes a minute to type it. Sorry, guys. Fallacy of ambiguity. When an argument contains ambiguous words, sloppy grammar, or confusion between two similar concepts. Okay, now, what are the 5 fallacies of ambiguity that we learned? Here are what they are, and here's their names. So 1, equivocation. So equivocation, that's one of them. After that, there is fallacy of amphibole. Amphibole. The third, fallacy of accent. Four, we have fallacy of division. And then 5th and final, fallacy of composition. Five fallacies of ambiguity, and that's our lesson plan today, to just define and explain and give examples of each of these 5 different fallacies of ambiguity. So we're going to start with the top, talk about equivocation. So I'm going to cover all of them. I wanted to list them first so that you know the sort of scope of what we will cover. But after having listed them, I'm going to do them one by one, starting at the top. So I'm going to clear the board so we can just focus for the moment on equivocation. Okay, so the equivocation fallacy, here's how this one goes basically. With equivocation, there is a key term in an argument that is used more than once, multiple times, but the problem is that the meaning of this key term changes during the course of the argument. Okay, so let me put it down. When a key term in an argument appears more than once, so multiple times this keyword or phrase appears more than once, and now here's the problem, with different meanings. Okay, so key term appears more than once, and the meaning changes during the course of the argument. That, we say, is when we equivocate or commit the fallacy of equivocation. Now, the best way I think for me to explain this is to show some examples, and let's work through these examples. So I'm going to put the definition in the chat again so I can clear the board. Here we see it in the chat to add to what I've written on the board. It's the same definition. You can see it in either place. So there's the definition. You can refer to it in the chat. Let me now give some examples, if I may. All right, so let's look at this example here. I'm going to write an argument with 2 premises that will lead to a conclusion. Okay, and so let's list the first premise. The first premise says, Alex is at the bank. And second premise is going to continue by saying a bank is a financial institution. Now, what do you think would be the conclusion, apparently, of this argument, if you could just deduce it? It's pretty elementary. If Alex is at a bank and a bank is a financial institution, therefore, what follows? Can you say? Let's get that, and then we can continue from there. What should be the conclusion of this argument? Let me know. Alex is at the bank, right? And a bank is a financial institution, yeah? So therefore what? Therefore he's at a financial institution. Very good, correct. Now, at a first glance, it looks like there's no issue with this argument. Doesn't the conclusion follow from the premises? Apparently, but if we examine the argument in a little bit more detail, we can see that it's possibly going to contain an equivocation here. So let me ask you this. Which word that you see listed in this argument appears more than once, but it could be having different meanings? Which word do you think might be the subject of equivocation in this case? So there is a word in the argument that's used multiple times, and it's a word that can have at least two definitions. Which word? Let me see if you can spot the possible term that we could equivocate on in the course of this argument. Go ahead, let me know. There's a word here that could be assigned different meanings, and it appears more than once in the argument. Which one is it? No, it is not the word is there, Matt. Sorry to say. Let's try again. It's, I think, more obvious. Don't overthink it. Is really doesn't have multiple meanings anyway. I mean, is just like something exists or something it has being. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, Stephen. Bank. Okay, so bank appears both in premise 1 and in premise 2. But let us ask about the word bank. So when we studied the language chapter, we all learned that, and you guys know this already, that a single word can have multiple different definitions. If you look into a dictionary, you'll see a word listed, and then you might see a primary definition, like the most commonly associated meaning, but then you look through the list of definitions and you see there's a secondary, tertiary, and so on, additional meanings given to the same word. As an example, if you look up the word school in the English dictionary, the first meaning that you see will probably be like a place for students to gain instruction towards a degree, like you guys are in school right now. But you might look down further and you see that another meaning of the same word is like a group of fish. Have you ever heard the plural of group of fish is like a school of fish, like we have a flock of birds? Now that's a different meaning of the same one word. Now in the same sense, I'm going to ask you guys, taking consideration of the word bank, maybe I want to create some different space up here. Okay, so bank. What's one possible meaning of the word bank that perhaps is the most obvious meaning? So what's one possible interpretation of the word bank? It could mean, like as we say in this argument, what? One obvious meaning of bank is what kind of thing? Tell me, what's bank mean? You saw the word. Now let's go with the definition. Financial institution, good, Alex. So like, a lending institution or where you can deposit funds to hold in your checking or saving account. So that's one meaning of the word bank, so financial institution. Let's call that bank in the first sense of the word. So I put in parentheses number 1. Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase Bank, a place where you go, deposit a check or withdraw money. That's the financial sense of the word bank. But what is a different, non-identical meaning of the same word? What's another word, meaning of bank, that does not have anything to do with a financial institution? Can you tell me that? So rack your brain, think about the one word bank, and tell me how it might mean something else. So you say, Matthias, a place to sit, not unlike a couch. Well, kind of, like you're thinking sitting on an embankment. The land alongside or sloping down to a river or lake. I like that also. Philip, you say a place used to store something. Yeah, so there is the blood bank, there's the food bank, there's the sperm bank. Let's go with this river bank thing, because I think that's a good illustration of the concept. So let's suppose all these are viable. Whatever you guys have said, like there's also the bank shot. We could continue, but I'm just going to limit it to 2 for the purposes of description of this concept. So let's say another meaning of the word bank is edge of a river, like the Mississippi River bank. And let's say that that's bank in the second sense of the term. So I placed the little parenthesis 2 here. Now, in the first premise where it says that Alex is at the bank, suppose that what that meant is that he's fishing at the edge of the riverbanks. You know, he's out there hanging out at the river. So he's at the river bank, that type of bank. The second premise where it says a bank is a financial institution, well, clearly in this premise, it's the first sense of the word that is implied. So, but if we've used the same word in different ways and we've switched up the meaning in the course of the argument, can we all agree that the conclusion does not follow anymore? It doesn't follow because we've equivocated on the meaning of the word bank. So for this conclusion to follow, we would have to know that the same sense of bank has been used throughout. But in this case, we've used one meaning of it in the first premise, a different meaning of it in the second premise, and therefore it clearly does not follow logically that he's at a financial institution. So there we have an example of equivocation. Now this is kind of like a trivial example because it's not like this would be the subject matter of like a real debate or argument in most cases. So I want to give you some other examples to add to this as well, including a couple from the book. So here's one that was mentioned in the book. Sometimes we commit equivocation in the course of dialogue or discussion with other people when we don't have the same understanding in the mind of a given word that is involved in our discussion. So imagine that there's two friends, Carl and Juan, and these two guys don't agree on the point of whether or not a person should be allowed to request a physician-assisted suicide if they're terminally ill. If you guys don't know, in our state, California, we did in fact by voter referendum approve a change to the law, I believe back in 2016 or so, to approve of physician-assisted suicide when a person is terminally ill. So our state is one state that allows this, but it's not the universal rule everywhere. And if you go back further in time, it used to be strictly prohibited for physician-assisted suicide to be done. There was a case of this guy back in the early 90s, I believe, named Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Sometimes people called him Dr. Death because he tried to provide this service to people that were terminally ill, but he ended up being in legal problems because it was not considered legal at the time. Anyway, so suppose Carl and Juan don't see eye to eye about whether this should be allowed. Carl thinks that it should be allowed and Juan doesn't. And so here's what Carl says to Juan. He says, Juan, look, listen, terminally ill patients have a right. They have a right to decide when they want to die. And Juan comes back and says, that's not true, Carl. There is no right to that in the US law. Now, you heard the exchange, I'll repeat it again. Carl says, Juan, terminally ill patients have a right to decide how and when they want to die. And Juan says, no, they don't. There is no right to that in the US law. Now, what word that the two individuals are using might be understood differently by the two parties. Can you help me with that? In that dialogue exchange between Carl and Juan, which word could be the basis for their disagreement, which is actually perhaps subject to equivocation here? Carl saying, terminally ill patients have a right to decide when they want to die. Juan say, there is no right to this in the US law. Which word maybe is the point that is equivocated? Very good, Philip, the word right. So let's go into that for a brief moment. I'm going to erase all this. So when Carl says that terminally ill patients have a right to decide this, what do you think he means by his word right? Like, what would be implied if a person says you have a right to like smoke marijuana or something? You know, if someone said that to you, what do you think would be the meaning of the word right? In what sense has the word been used there? When someone says you have a right to do something, like, for example, request physician-assisted suicide if you're terminally ill. In the usage of Carl, what does the word right mean? Try to give me an answer. Carl says terminally ill patients have a right to decide this. Okay, good, that you're like entitled to it, that you should have the liberty to do it. Very good, guys. So exactly, when Carl speaks about it, therefore, he says it's like a moral right. It ought to be recognized by our government and our laws. That's just saying that it ought to be, because somehow, like metaphysically, human nature requires that we give people this liberty. So the concept of a right as spoken of by Carl is like a moral right. But when Juan fires back and says, that's not true, there's no right to that in the US law. What do you think he means when he says there's no right to it in the law? Juan, he's using the word right in a different sense. He's not talking about the moral concept that you ought to be given such rights. But rather when he says there's no such right in the law, what is his usage referring to when he says the word? So for Carl, it's a moral claim. We ought to be giving people these freedoms and liberties and entitlements to choose that. Juan says there's no right to that in the law. Okay, that's correct. So it's not yet been written into the law. It's not been codified or canonized in the law. So he's using right in a legal sense. The other guy, Juan. So that explains why they appear to disagree. They're actually talking past each other. Carl is saying people ought to be given these liberties. And Juan is saying, as of today, the law does not allow it. So they're talking about right in two different senses. One is talking about it normatively, and the other is talking about the existing body of law. And you can imagine a similar type of discussion happening before women were given the right to vote. You know, these discussions did happen. People would say and did say, you know, women have a right to vote. Women, human beings, all human beings, whether you're a man or woman, they have a right to go in there and choose who are their government leaders. And someone else back in because, you know, women in America were only given the right to vote in 1920. So let's say it's 1915 and one person says, women, they have the right to vote. And then another guy says, no, they don't. If you look at our laws, there's no right for women to vote in the law. One person's talking about the morally righteous claim that this ought to be recognized. And the other person says, as of today, it hasn't yet been established in the law. So they're really not talking about right in the same exact sense. They're equivocating on the term in the course of their discussion, and that's why they appear to have a disagreement. And that's what the book says too. In the argument, Carl is using the term right as a moral right, whereas Juan is using a different definition of right, that is, as a legal right. Legal rights and moral rights are not the same. For example, we might have had a legal right to own slaves before the Civil War, but we should all agree that we have no moral right to do that. Okay, so there you go. Another example that's also in the book. Let's go with another. I'll just make sure it really sinks in. So the textbook quotes a news report from 2010. Back then in 2010, the United States Senate was led by Democratic Senator Harry Reid. The Democrats were in the majority then. In 2014, Republicans took control under McConnell. And now it's 2021, and Democrats are back in power by a razor-thin margin with Schumer as the majority leader. Anyway, in 2010, it was Reid, and he had this quote. He just said this at one point in a statement. He said, in America, if you're a man and you're out of work, you may beat up your wife. Now, Fox News, fascinated by that quote, took it out of context, and they reported this. The panel of Fox News columnists said, how horrible is Harry Reid? He thinks that it's okay for men that are poor and out of work to beat up their wives. That's a disgusting thing. He says it's okay if you're poor to beat up your wife. Why would he say that? Now, let's listen to his statement again. The statement was, if you're a man and you're out of work, you may beat up your wife. Which word in that original statement do you think is being used differently by the Fox News team in this example? Can you tell me that? He said, if you're a man and you're out of work, you may beat up your wife. And here's the clap back from Fox. That's a horrifying thing to say. You're telling me that you think it's okay for men that are poor to beat their wives. What a terrible thing to say. So which word is leading to this perhaps unfair criticism? Which word that's being interpreted differently or equivocated on when we compare the original statement and what it means to the interpretation given by Fox? Which word in the original statement is the subject of this changing meaning? What do you think? I'll read it again. The statement was, if you're a man and you're out of work, you may beat up your wife. Okay, very good, Philip. The word may. Let's consider the word may for a brief moment. So what is one possible meaning of that word may? When people say that something may occur, sometimes what is the meaning of the word may? One meaning of may. I'm not talking about the month, so let's not go there. But that is another possible meaning of the same word. In that case, it would be capitalized, so I don't know if it counts. But anyway, we're talking about two other possibilities. May could mean what? When a person says that something may happen, one definition of the word may is what? May in the sense of what? Okay, so Lan, you say likely. And then Elizabeth, you say permission. Very good. Let me modify your suggestion just slightly though, Lan. Instead of likely, I think it weaker a little bit, possible. Possible. So may we sometimes talk about in terms of possibility. Something may happen, meaning that it could happen, that it's possible it could happen. But in other cases, as you wrote, Elizabeth, we talk about may and we don't mean that it's possible. We rather mean that you're permitted to do it or you're allowed, you're granting permission. So that's the permission sense of may. Now, Harry Reid's original statement, he said, if you're a man and you're out of work, you may beat up your wife. Do you really think he was saying, if you're a man and you're out of work, I'm giving you a green light. Go ahead, you may beat up your wife. Feel free. No. He was saying something else. He was saying that if you just look at the statistics, if you go down the socioeconomic ladder, there's a greater statistical probability for people to commit domestic violence when they have less wealth. Like just considering the cases of domestic violence, there's a greater propensity for them to happen in households which hold less wealth. That's not saying that he approves of it or that he's giving someone permission. He's just commenting that when wealth is less, this becomes more possible. It's sort of like this. If I look at the weather forecast tomorrow and it says there's a 50% chance of rain, do you know that I could say it may rain tomorrow? And that would be true. It may rain tomorrow because it's possible. But I'm not saying I'm giving permission to the weather to rain because obviously I have no control over the weather. So I'm not saying weather, you may rain. I mean, I can't address myself to the weather and give it permission. So in that case, I'm talking about possibility. But when the Fox News team takes his comment out of context, they make it seem as though the use of the word may was in this permission sense. And that's why they attacked his words. They say, well, how bad is it for someone to say that it's okay for poor men to beat their wives? And I'll read then the remaining part from the book. It says this: the Fox reporters drew the conclusion that Reid thinks it is okay for men who are out of work to beat up their wives. In doing so, they committed the fallacy of equivocation. Since the term may has more than one meaning, it can be used to mean permission, or it can be used to express possibility. In fact, Senator Reid actually said men that are out of work tend to be abusive, and therefore it becomes likelier. He was not giving unemployed men permission to beat their wives, nor was he condoning such abuse. So that's just yet another case. Sometimes equivocation happens when we use relative terms and we apply them to different subjects. So take this as an example. 2-year-old Katie is very tall. 2-year-old little Katie is very tall. Her father, on the other hand, is not tall, but he's about average in height. So does the conclusion therefore follow that Katie is taller than her father? No. Because we've used the word tall twice, once to say Katie is tall, another time to say that the father's not tall. But tall, when referred to the case of the child, means tall for an average 2-year-old toddler. So she's taller than average given the category that she's in. And when we say that the father is not tall, we mean not tall with respect to a different standard, not tall with respect to average adult male height, which is like 5'10" or something. So in that case, it doesn't follow that because she's tall and he's not, she's taller in height than him. She's tall for a 2-year-old. He's not tall for an adult man. And in that same case, again, we would be committing equivocation to draw the false inference that she's taller than him. Okay, now I'm going to use one more example to kind of to make this fully complete and thorough. One last thing, though, about that other example with may and all of that. Another case I thought of is the word can, which is similar to may. Sometimes when we use the word can, we talk about what you're capable of doing, what's possible. And in some cases, when we talk about can, we mean what you're being allowed to do. Like, you can go out to play. It's okay for you to play. That's like saying you can. I'm giving you permission. But if you're just physically able, then that's a different meaning. Like, you're capable of it. So have you ever heard someone ask permission to use the restroom? Like, excuse me, can I go to the bathroom? And then some wise guy is trying to make a joke, and they're like, I don't know, can you? That would be equivocation right there, because the question is obviously asked from the standpoint of getting permission. When the person replies, they make it seem as though the person was asking a different question. Am I able to use the bathroom? Am I physically able to do it? But obviously, that's done for humorous effect. Okay, now here, one last. I wanted to show you that sometimes with the equivocation fallacy, there's something more important on the line, or there's something like a little bit more kind of consequential. So sometimes I teach other classes at other places, and in one case I teach the philosophy of love and sex at Cal State Fullerton. It's kind of an interesting class. We go back through the history of writings and literature on human romance and love, and then all the way up to the current day. We read stuff on the ethics of sexual consent, which is kind of like a hot topic now in the wake of the Me Too movement, and women's stories kind of taking to the fore of our cultural consciousness. So let me show you an example of an argument that could be equivocation within the context of sexual consent. Okay, so suppose that the first premise of the argument says that if an adult consents to it, then it is permissible to have sex with them. So if an adult gives consent to a sexual act, then in that case, it is permissible to proceed to do it or whatever. Okay, now, suppose that in the second premise, we follow that by saying, by not physically resisting or fighting, she gave consent. Now, in this argument, it looks like, until we examine the fallacy involved a little closer, from premise one, if an adult gives consent to a sexual act, then it's permissible to proceed. Premise two, by not physically resisting or fighting me, she did give consent. So the conclusion, at least on a first glance, would be, therefore, it was permissible for us to have sex, or it was permissible for me to have sex with her. Okay, now, which word, let's try this again, which word in this argument here could be interpreted with different meanings, and it does appear more than once. So a very key term in the whole argument. Let me know if you can spot it and tell me which one you think it is, and then we'll explain how possibly this is an equivocation fallacy for sure. What's the word that could be the subject of the changing meaning from the different premises and statements? It's not permission, no, Elizabeth, although that's a decent attempt. But permission doesn't even appear more than once. Well, I guess permissible appears up here in the first premise, and then it's also in the conclusion. But no, that's not the one. It's rather consent. Correct, Lan. The word consent. So let's go over this. In premise one, it says if an adult gives consent, then it's okay to go forward with the sexual act. Now, you guys ought to know this, because certainly there's been much discussion about what real consent is. So what kind of consent do you think is the definition of that does make it legitimately valid to continue having sex with someone or to pursue a further act? What type of consent makes it okay and does give real permission? Which type of consent? Like, what has to happen for it to be valid, authorized consent to go forward? No, Philip, that's not it. Because you can't read the person's mind. So let's start again. What kind of consent makes it okay for you to have sex with somebody? Because you say in the right state of mind. What does that mean? I don't know what right state of mind is. I mean, you can't read minds. So it's not, we're talking about consent. What kind of consent makes it okay for you to just go ahead and have sex with somebody? Okay, well, Matthias, you say enthusiastic consent. Okay, that's getting to the right kind of idea. I don't know if I would say the word enthusiastic is the essential way to put it, but basically it's something like this. It's explicit consent. It's explicitly communicated or conveyed to the person. They don't have to guess. They don't have to interpret or sort of read between the lines. It's a verbal act of explicit consent where you authorize or affirm that this person can go forward with it. So you say yes, or you initiate the act. So it becomes obvious by the context that this is something that you want to happen. So it has to be explicit. It has to be not like the subject of another person's interpretation or guessing game, but communicated explicitly, either verbally or otherwise. So that's the kind of consent that does make it legitimate to go forward. So let's call that consent 1, explicit. But in the second premise, what kind of consent is being discussed here? This is not telling a person, yes, let's do this and I want to. This is just failure to show physical resistance or to fight back when the act has already happened. And that's not the same thing as saying yes. This is like the person didn't fight me off. I don't have any bruises. I don't have any wounds. So if they didn't fight me, they must have wanted to do it. But that's not the same thing as saying that you want to do it. So this switches from explicit and verbal agreement to tacit and implied. And if that is the case, the conclusion does not follow, because we've equivocated on the key term of consent, starting with a strong notion of consent, and then proceeding to a very weak notion to try and carry through our conclusion. Now, we should all know there are various and very valid reasons why a woman might not physically fight back in the case where she was being raped, because she might be fearful that if she makes a big show of physical resistance, this might incite the attacker to cause further harm, injury, or death. And in some cases, the person may be physically incapacitated at the time, or passed out or inebriated. In that case, they're not capable of doing the actions that would constitute physical resistance or fighting back. So you cannot infer from the absence of physical resistance that the person agrees as though they had said yes. So anyway, just another example to think about, and it's a little bit more, I guess, topical and relevant than some of the silly examples about, John's at the bank's where you have money, so he's at a place with money. Okay, anyway then, we can move on. So spent a lot of good time talking about equivocation first. But as you know, there's 4 other fallacies of ambiguity beyond that. So the next one is called Amphibole. Okay, so the Amphibole fallacy. This is the fallacy of grammatical ambiguity. And so the basic definition of it is that this is when there is a grammatical mistake in an argument which allows for more than one conclusion to be drawn. Well, yeah, Philip, that's also true. Verbal consent while drunk is not valid. But that doesn't obviate or contradict the force of the argument here. There can be cases in which consent is no longer valid because it's produced under coercion or under deception. So it's possible also due to, what do they call it? Incapacity. So a verbal statement made while one is incoherent, unconscious, blacked out is an exception to the general principle. So if you wanted, we can make the explicit act of verbal consent import those features, like done of sound mind. So I guess your earlier statement of sound mind, maybe you meant to imply that the person has said yes with a sound mind. Now I can kind of get to your same page and vibe with what you were saying. But initially you just said sound mind and you didn't pair it with the statement that the person has also offered consent. So it made it seem as though the person was just inferring that they had a sound mind, that they were just vibing with, the sexual act. But I think we kind of understand each other right now. Anyway, though, let's continue, may we, with Amphibole. So Amphibole is the fallacy that happens when there's a grammatical mistake in an argument which allows more than one conclusion to be drawn. Okay, so there it is, when there is a grammatical mistake in an argument which allows more than one conclusion to be drawn. Okay, I just put the definition also there in the chat one time. So anyway, yeah, when there is a grammatical mistake in an argument which allows more than one conclusion to be drawn, that's what we call amphibole. So let me just give you some examples in this case that are just like statements where there is an amphibole in it. Okay, suppose that I told you that Alex and, well, Alex is a little gender neutral name, so maybe I'll try something a little more clearly masculine. Steve and John were hanging out and they decided to go take a drive in his car. Now, can you tell me what's ambiguous grammatically about that statement? It says, Steve and John were hanging out and decided to take a ride in his car. What's ambiguous? If you can figure that out, let me know. We'll continue from there. Steve and John are going to take a ride in his car. Can you tell me what there is about that that's not so fully explicit or clear? Yeah, whose car? That's right, Stephen, because we named two male subjects, but then we simply used the male pronoun he, and it's not clear to whom this pronoun attaches. It could be Steve's car, it could be John's car, but without further clarification, we are left wondering what conclusion to draw. Whose car was the car that they took? If I say that Steve and John were having a chat about his girlfriend, or they were fighting over his weapon, we don't know who the reference of his is without further disambiguation. So that would be one case of an amphibole. How about, let me give you this example. The researcher took pictures of the malnourished children, but they were underdeveloped. What do you think could be the ambiguity there? The researcher took pictures of the underdeveloped the researcher took pictures of the malnourished children, but they were underdeveloped. What do you think could be the ambiguous grammatical mistake there? Guy took pictures of these malnourished children, but they were underdeveloped. What's the ambiguity? Right, so what was underdeveloped? We have a plural pronoun here, which is they. With they, it's possible that they refers to the content of the things being pictured in the photos, namely the malnourished children. So they're malnourished, maybe they're not physically developed children. But the process of developing photographs can also be what was not developed, the pictures of the children not fully developed. So if a person said that to you, you would have to ask them, what do you mean by they? They, the children, are not developed, or they, the photos, were not developed? And once again, it's an amphibole, right? Here's something in the book as another example. So a little backstory. There was at one point in the early 2000s, a woman named Terry Schiavo who suffered a terrible traumatic brain injury from an automobile accident, basically. And after that, she was being kept alive on extraordinary life support systems, but she was basically in a vegetative coma. You guys know about DMX, the rapper? Have you heard about his case? Well, it's very similar to that. Maybe even worse, though. I don't know what his situation is, but in the case of Schiavo, the overwhelming consensus of all the doctors was she's got total brain death, and she has no possible chance to ever return to consciousness. So she's basically a vegetable now, and the only reason that she is alive is because we haven't pulled the plug and we're keeping her alive with these machines. So because of that, the family members of Terry Schiavo had disagreements about what her wishes would have been, because she did not leave an advance directive. An advance directive is a statement that a person can leave behind in case they want people to know exactly what their wishes would be if they ever find themselves in like a comatose state with no possible prospects for recovery. So with the advance directive, a person can say, if this ever happens to me, please pull the plug, or please continue all extraordinary life support systems. But anyway, she had no such directive, so they kind of had to guess what she would have wanted. And they didn't all agree about what she would have wanted. Some thought that she wouldn't have wanted to stay alive on this life support machine. Others thought that, you know, she would have wanted to hold out hope for a miracle and somehow keep it going. So here's a statement. This sentence says, Terry Schiavo's mother and her husband are on opposite sides of this battle over her life. Now, which part of that statement do you think is the ambiguity? I'll read it again. Shivo's mother and her husband are basically fighting over Shivo's life. They don't agree. They're on opposite sides. So what's ambiguous there, where it says Shivo's mother and her husband are on opposite sides of this topic? Can you tell me what's the ambiguity? Because Terry Shivo's mother and her husband don't agree about whether to pull the plug, basically. What's the ambiguity there? Correct, Land. Whose husband? Whose husband? It says her husband, but there are two different women being mentioned. There's Shivo herself, and then there's her mom. So one interpretation is that Terry Shivo's mother and her husband, meaning Shivo's husband, don't agree. But another available interpretation is Terry Shivo's mother and the husband of the mother, so basically Shivo's parents, don't agree. Which one is it? Well, here's the truth. In fact, it was Shivo's husband that didn't agree with Shivo's mother and father. So mother and father wanted to keep her alive on the life support machine. Shivo's husband thought she wouldn't have wanted this. And so those are the two sides that weren't in agreement. But you wouldn't know that just by the initial statement. You'd have to ask a question. Who do you mean by her? In fact, that story, the end of it, it got even a little bit crazier because the governor of Florida at the time was Jeb Bush. That's the brother of former President W. Bush. And he got involved because he wanted to take the side of the parents. So he ordered them not to remove the feeding tube in line with the parents' wishes that she not be taken off life support. And that made it kind of, a lot of people thought this is, the state interfering in like a private matter. Shouldn't the husband have the sole authority on the question? Anyway, though, she eventually, of course, did die because it was impossible to revive her. But case of Terry Shivo, example of Amphibole. A couple more here from the book. Sometimes advertisers will be grammatically ambiguous because they want to kind of leave you with an ambiguous message about a product that they're advertising. As an example of that from the book, they talk about fragrance company Clinique. Clinique created a new fragrance called Happy. And in their advertising materials, the sort of tagline that's driving the sale was happy. Wear it and be happy. Wear it and be happy. But what's the function grammatically of the word and in that slogan? Because one way of looking at it is that it says, if you wear it, you'll become happy. So could and be a conditional word, like if you wear it, then you will be happy as a result. Or we could interpret and to be a conjunction word, like wear it, and then separate from that and unrelated to it, you'll be happy. Now, suppose that a person bought the fragrance and they had one of the worst years of their lives, pandemic breaks out or something. So they complained to Clinique. They're like, you guys, false advertising. It says there, wear it and be happy. I wore it and I'm not happy. Well, then they could probably say, it's a bit ambiguous. I know we said and to be happy, but it's possible to look at that as a mere conjunction, not as a causal connection. And in that case, they'd be able to use the ambiguity of the phrase to escape any kind of criticism from that side. One more example, and then we'll move to the next. There's also sometimes the possibility of using Amphibole for humorous effect, like in comedy. And so they include a little piece of dialogue from a comedy film of the 90s called Spy Hard, Leslie Nielsen. It's an old, funny kind of spoof movie, but here's a piece of dialogue. The agent is talking to the director, and the agent says, "Sir, we have intercepted a very disturbing satellite transmission from our listening post on the Rock of Gibraltar." Director asks, "What is it?" Agent says, "Oh, what is it? Okay, it's this really big rock that sticks out of the water off the south coast of Spain." Now look at that dialogue. The question that the director asked, what is it, is the subject matter of, I guess, the Amphibole, because we're not sure what he asked with the reference of it. Is it asking, what is the Rock of Gibraltar? Or is it asking, what is the content of the message that was intercepted from the listening post on the Rock of Gibraltar? Now, obviously, the common sense interpretation would have been, what's the message? But for humorous effect, they allow the speaker in the movie to interpret him as having asked, what is the Rock of Gibraltar itself? And so the response is supposed to lead to some humor. Okay, guys, so anyway, that's the Amphibole fallacy. In general, try to use language and grammar properly so that you can't be misinterpreted. And if you hear someone else make a statement or an argument where there is this kind of grammatical ambiguity, you might have to just ask the person for rephrasing of the words or claims so that you can disambiguate whatever the grammatical error was. Okay, so that's amphibole. And we're going to the next. So after amphibole, the next is what's called fallacy of accent. So the fallacy of accent happens when the meaning of an argument or statement changes depending on which word or phrase within it is emphasized. Okay? So when the meaning of an argument or statement changes depending on which word or phrase in it is given emphasis or accented. Yeah, so one interesting thing about language, whether it's written or spoken, is that we're sometimes able to highlight a specific word or phrase within a part of speech or writing by adding some kind of stress or emphasis to it. In writing, oftentimes you'll see this as like bold or all caps or sometimes italics that shows you that that phrase is supposed to be kind of accented a little bit more or more stress placed upon it. And in speech, when we accent a word, we often lean into the pronunciation of it a little bit more. So here, let me give you an example that's used in the book, and then we'll go with a few others as well. So imagine this interaction between a mother and the delinquent daughter. Mother comes home, and what she sees when she gets there is that the tool shed in the backyard garden area has been burned down, and it's just sitting there in a smoldering pile of ashes. So she goes over to her daughter, who she can see kind of with some ashy smudges on her, and she's nearby there with like some burnt out matches. And so she knows this, basically her daughter burned down the shed by messing around with matches. So she goes over to the daughter upset, mother does, and she says, "Come on, why did you do this? Didn't I tell you don't play with matches?" And imagine this is the daughter's response. "I know, Mom, I know, but the thing is, I know that's what you said. I wasn't playing with the matches. I was sitting back here, lighting things on fire to see how fire works. So that's not a game. This is not like a silly fun and game thing. I wasn't playing with the matches, so I didn't break the rule." Now, what word or phrase is the child emphasizing or accenting, which is changing the original intended meaning of the parent's rule? Can you tell me that? So one last time back and forth between the mom and the daughter. Mom's like, "I can't believe you burned down the shed. Didn't I tell you don't play with matches?" Daughter says, "I wasn't playing with the matches. I was just, conducting an experiment with the matches. So I didn't really do anything wrong." What is the accented or emphasized word in the child's response that's changing the original meaning of the mother's required rule? Let me know. Don't play with matches. Didn't I tell you don't play with matches? I know, I'm not playing with them. I'm lighting stuff on fire with a serious demeanor. So what's the accented phrase or term? Playing. Very good. Yeah, so by leaning on that word, I'm not playing with them though. I'm lighting stuff on fire for science. Now, what did the mother mean though? What's the obvious intended meaning that the mother had when she originally said, "Listen to me, don't play with matches"? What do you think should have been understood by means of that statement? What was the real message that the mother delivered when she said, "Don't ever play with matches," or "Don't play with matches"? Yeah, just don't touch the matches. Don't do anything with matches. Don't light them. Don't use them. Don't light fires with matches. Now, what the daughter has done is she took that statement, and by accenting playing, she's trying to make it seem as if this was the message. Mess with matches all you like, as long as what you do with them does not amount to like fun and games. If you're doing something serious with the matches, that's okay. It just can't be playtime. But obviously that's not the message that the mother did give. And so by placing this accent on the statement, she's converted it from one thing to another, and that's a fallacy. Let me give you some other examples. Okay, so take the case where like a parent doesn't like one friend that their kid's hanging out with. Have you ever guys experienced that? I mean, I know I have as a kid. You know, they think you're hanging out with someone that's a bad influence on you. And so they're like, listen, I'm going to tell you right now, I just don't ever want that. I see you hanging out with this kid in your room and stuff in our house, but I don't like this kid. They're bad influence. So hear me clearly. I do not ever want to see that friend of yours walk through this door again. In this house, they better not come through that door. Okay? Now, let's say like a week passes by, parent comes home, sees the kid hanging out in their room with his friend again. And they're like, what are you doing? So they call him over, like, hey, come over here. What are you doing? I told you don't let him in the house. Why are they here? Now, what do you think is going to be the child's response if this is yet another example of accent fallacy? Did you follow my little narrative? What do you think the child will say when called out by the parent who says, why are they back here? I said very clearly I don't ever want them coming through this door again. What do you think will be our child's response? There you go, Philip, exactly. Yeah, well, I heard you loud and clear. You said, don't ever let them come through the door again. And that's why I let them in through the window. You see there's a little rope right there. So I technically didn't break the rule, so you can't get mad at me. Obviously, when the parent says, this is like a saying, it's just an expression, I don't ever want them walking through this door again, you're supposed to understand what they really mean, not too hard to understand, is that you don't want them in the house. You don't want them on the premises. You don't want them anywhere near this house. So the child is like trying to think of a way around the rule by placing an accent on the words coming through the door. They didn't come through the door, haha. Obviously, that's yet again accent fallacy. In the book, another example is this. Suppose the student reads the school newspaper, and the school newspaper says, we're going to start cracking down on off-campus drinking. And the student's like, awesome. I'm glad that they're cracking down on off-campus drinking. So that means I can bring a flask to class because they're fine with on-campus drinking. That's obviously not the message. I mean, what it means is, in addition to our already established rules that prohibit drinking on campus, we also want to crack down on like drinking at school events and club meetings and things like that. So if the person accents off campus, they're getting the wrong message from the rule and from the provided material in the paper. So yeah, like in language, it's just interesting overall to think about how accent, inflection, placing stress on certain words or phrases can really change the tenor or the way that a message is communicated or understood. Like, here's an example. If I just say these words to you in a flat monotone, they carry some meaning. But if I start accenting some of these words, the meaning shifts around a little bit. So consider if I say to you, why did you steal my bike from me? That has information and you understood the sentence. But now if I say it with accent on some of the words and not others, it can kind of influence the way that you think about the message. So if I say, why did you steal my bike from me? Now I've placed the emphasis on the word bike. And in that case, what you kind of take away is, of all the things that you could have stolen, my bike, my precious bike, why did you take that? I would have thought you would have taken anything else. Or I could have added the emphasis to the word you. Why did you steal my bike from me? Now with that accent, it sort of implies, of all people, you? Really? I thought you would be the one person that would not have stolen my bike. So why did you steal my bike from me? Or another possibility, why did you steal my bike from me? Now it's like I am placing emphasis on the word me, and so it conveys, I know you're kind of like a thief and you steal things, but I would have thought that I, at least, wouldn't have been the one that you would have stolen from. So anyway, guys, these are just ways of thinking about the concept that's being mentioned here. In certain cases, through the application of an accent or a stress or an emphasis on certain words or phrases, the meaning of an idea, word, or argument can change. Now, last example. And this is, I think, a little bit more of an interesting example that has more of a deep consequence for our real life. As we talked about at the beginning of chapter 5, sometimes there are cult recruiters that try to win people over to the ranks of the cult. And one tactic that is sometimes used is kind of like a fallacy of accent, which is called proof texting. Proof texting is this. If you know that people already have an established religious view, like say a person's a Christian, then you might be able to quote some of the scripture out of context and then accent some words within the scriptures to make it seem as though the scripture supports your own agenda. Okay, and that's what proof texting is. So here's one example mentioned in the book. Say that they're trying to get you to join the Brethren, Jim Roberts' cult. Join with us. We're the righteous movement that you need to be a part of. And they say, I don't know about that. It sounds weird. And you're like, well, come on, you're a Christian, right? Well, even the Bible says that you should join our cult, because here, read Luke 14:33. It says, so likewise, whosoever of you that forsaketh not all that he hath cannot be my disciple. Now, you read it. It says right there, if you don't forsake all that you have, then you can't be the disciple of Jesus. And that means that you're supposed to join the Brethren and give up all your friends and family and social contacts. I mean, what other way is there to interpret this passage of Scripture? But notice that the person's trying to trick you because they've added all this emphasis to the phrase, all that he hath. And that is supposed to make it seem as though the Scripture itself is indicative of, compelling you to join with this Brethren cult. And other scriptures could be mentioned as well. You could say, it says in the Bible, be thy brother's keeper. Right there, it says brother's keeper. What do you think? Who's the brothers? We're the Brethren. So it's telling you join the Brethren. So again, sometimes people can take passages, statements, written materials out of context, apply an accent or a stress to it, and then manipulate and misunderstand, sometimes intentionally, the original meaning of the written passage or words. So we've got to be careful about that. If you're not sure which, if any, term is being emphasized in an argument or statement, ask the person to repeat or explain what they meant. And sometimes you have to make sure that you are not taken out of context. Sometimes people will take your words or written statements and will try to add emphasis to some parts of it that change your intent. And if that happens, you have to call the person out and say, no, that's a fallacy of accent, and that's not at all what you should have understood by the way I spoke or wrote. Okay, so there's another one, fallacy of accent. Now there's two more in this initial set of 5. There's fallacy of division and fallacy of composition. So let me at least speak about division, and if we need to, we can take time on Thursday to finish the other one, but maybe we'll get into it as well. So here we go, one more at least, fallacy of division. Okay, so the fallacy of division is basically this. It's when we incorrectly assume that a characteristic of an entire group is a characteristic of each member of the group. So a characteristic of a whole group is incorrectly assumed to be a characteristic of each member of the group. Okay, so characteristic of a whole group, incorrectly assumed to be a characteristic of each member of the same group. That's the division fallacy. Now, the division fallacy has a general formal structure, and here's the basic format that the division fallacy has. So I'm going to put it in this little corner to set it off from the definition. The form of the division fallacy is as follows. We start by saying some group labeled G has characteristic C. So group G has characteristic C. Okay, the second premise just says that X is a member of group G. So the conclusion, therefore, appears to be that X, the individual, also has that characteristic that the group has. X has characteristic C. Sorry, it's a little low on the board there, but I'm trying to talk through it too, so you can hopefully follow the description. once again, as I read it here, the form of division fallacy begins with some group, and we label it G just for the purposes of generality, because this could be any number of different groups. It could be like a sports team, a country, a hotel, whatever. So some group has a certain feature, and again, we use the label C as a variable that's just a placeholder for whatever the given characteristic might be in the individual example. X also is just a stand-in for the name or whatever reference to whoever the individual member is. So here, let me give you this example. Say group G is the group men, okay? Men have this characteristic overall of being taller than the average woman. So men on average are taller than women. That's just an objective fact. If you look at tables, you'll see that like in America, the average male height is something like 5'10" or 11. Average female height is something like 5'5" or 6. So anyway, men overall have the characteristic taller than women. Now suppose that we say Danny DeVito is a member of the group man. Basically, he's a man. I don't know if you know enough about this actor, but this is a well-known Hollywood actor, Danny DeVito, but he's very short. He currently, I think, still appears in the comedy sitcom It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Back in the 80s and 90s, he had a lot of movies, Twins, and there's other cases too. But anyway, he's 4'11". So if we say that men are taller than women, Danny DeVito is a man, so Danny DeVito is taller than the average woman, that would be an incorrect conclusion. So in other words, just because a group has a feature does not necessarily mean that every single individual member of the group has that feature. Sometimes the whole can be different than each part. And sometimes the whole group, the whole collective, can have attributes that you don't see in each person or member. Here's another case. The United States is the wealthiest nation in the world. So let's say the group here is the United States, and the characteristic is wealthiest in the world. Now, you are a member of the United States. You're one citizen, so you're a part of this country. So does the conclusion follow that you are the wealthiest person in the world? No. The nation is the wealthiest, you're a member of it, but just because a country is wealthy doesn't mean that every single individual member of the country is fantastically rich or wealthy. Okay, another example right there. I don't know, say that there was like a sports team, which you thought is the best team in sports, and then you just refer to one member of the team. It does not necessarily mean that every member of the team is the best athlete in the sport, just because the team as a whole is. So once again, that would be a division fallacy. It's called division because it starts with a feature of a group, and then it concludes with a statement that each member of the group has that same feature. So it's like we divide from the whole down to the parts. But that's not always the case. I'll give you another example. I am visible. I'm visible to the naked eye, me, Dr. Vujic. So in other words, you don't need a microscope or whatever to see me. You're looking at me right now with your naked eye. Now, I'm made out of cells. So like take a cell in my body. It's a part of the whole organism that I am. So I am visible to the naked eye. A cell swabbed out from my cheek is a part of me. Does that mean that the cell is visible to the naked eye? No. So just because my whole person is visible to the naked eye does not necessarily mean that each atom or cell within me, the parts, are visible to the naked eye. So in that case, the whole has a feature that the parts don't have. When they combine together, the aggregate of all of them forms an object that you can see. But if you divide down to individual little elements, they don't have the same feature visible to the naked eye. So those are just a bunch of various different examples of the fallacy of division. In every single case that I'm giving you, we start with a group, we identify a feature that it has, we point out that there's some individual that's a part of the group, and then we incorrectly infer that they must have the same feature the whole group has. How about families, guys? Maybe some of you can relate to this. My family is loud. So the group is the family that I'm a part of. And the characteristic is loud. So when we all get together, it's loud, it's active, a lot of jokes, people, being boisterous and all that kind of good spirits. So my family's loud, I'm a member of the family. Does that mean that I'm loud? Not necessarily. You can be a part of a big, loud family where you're an exception to the general pattern that you see in the whole group. So another possible case could be stereotypes. I would not repeat any negative cultural stereotypes because, of course, those aren't fair. But sometimes there are positive ones, I guess. And so that's not as controversial. let me use one that the book mentioned. So Canadians kind of have a cultural reputation for being very friendly. When you compare them against, I don't know, like New Yorkers and stuff, like the Canadians are famous for wanting to help, wanting to give information and advice, even to strangers, and etc. So suppose we take that as a truism. Canadians, the whole group as a whole, they're friendly. Derek is a Canadian. Does it follow that he is friendly? Not necessarily. And the same would go for like negative stereotypes that I don't want to just repeat, especially not on camera. But you know, sometimes people say, oh, like this group of people don't know how to do blah, 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 or this group of people has that feature. The stereotypes in and of themselves, when they're negative, are usually destructive and unfair. But even if you thought there was any kernel of truth to them, it's not necessarily fair to say that every single person who's a part of that category would have the same feature. Okay, so we've gone through 4 of these fallacies of ambiguity today. The only one that's left out that we will begin with on Thursday is the fallacy of composition. And I'll just say this as a little preview to you so that you have it on your mind. Composition is like the flip side of division. It's the same thing except in the reverse order. So what it says is X is a member of group G. X has characteristic C. So therefore, the whole group has a characteristic that the individual member does. And that, of course, is not true either, at least not necessarily. If you take an atom out of my body, you need a microscope to see it. But obviously, you don't need a microscope to see my whole body. So like imagine that a person says, the atoms in my body are not visible without a microscope. So therefore, I'm not visible without a microscope. Clearly, this is false. Or the room 101 is small, so the hotel is small. Not necessarily. You can have a big hotel with a bunch of small rooms. So not necessarily that the feature of each part is a feature of the whole system. Let's say a person says, I'm poor, and I'm a United States citizen, so the United States is poor. That would not necessarily be true at all. So with composition, we start with the individual part, and we make a conclusion about the whole based on a feature that the individual has. And in either direction, that's not a bulletproof assumption that the group has it, so the individual has to have it. Nor is it a fair and necessary truth that individual members having a feature implies that the whole group they're a part of has it. Okay, guys, so that's for today. I really appreciate your attendance and your focus on the class. Make sure to keep coming. I know that attendance is sometimes up and down, and we're online, so you have every incentive to sometimes watch the meetings later. But I like it when we're all together and we can interact. So keep coming if you can, and if you're watching this on a tape recording delay, just come to the next meeting if possible. Other than that, guys, have a great one, and do email me for your requests for your midterm scores, and I'll be going through all your emails as they come in. And if you send me one, within 2 days, you'll get your response for sure. So are you all good, everyone? Let me know in the chat, and if so, then I'll be able to close it down for today. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Lan, and to all the rest. Have a good one. But I don't want to close just yet. Let me make sure that we're all together. Thanks, Anna, Elizabeth. Okay, perfect. Well, like I say, have a good one. Take care. Stay safe. And we'll be in touch. You can email me. And other than that, I'll see you back on Thursday. Okay, great. Take it easy. Bye-bye.